Okay, so I think we're going to start. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm David Gersten. I'm the Director of Arts, Letters, and Numbers. And I want to welcome you all to this really wonderful conversation with Ren Weschler and Walter Murch. I'm super excited about this. This program is a part of a series, in fact, of conversations titled Mr. Weschler's Cabinet of Wonders that Ren has curated for our Sunship exhibition in the 17th Architecture Biennale. Thank you, as always, Ren, for all that you're bringing to this exhibition. And of course, I want to welcome and thank Walter Murch for joining us again. Fantastic to have you back. It's really an honor, Walter, to have you with. We're so happy that you've come back to share some more insights. As everyone knows, Walter is a legendary sound and film editor behind many, many incredible classic films, The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, The English Patient, and many, many more. But he also is an incredibly wide-ranging explorer. He has been, for decades, finding unexpected discoveries. And today's talk, titled The Uncanny Mathematics Undergirding the Egyptian Pyramids, it will surely be filled with the unexpected. And I'm really thankful that you're here and looking forward to it. I'll just add that at the end, we will have, at the end of the conversation, we will have some time for questions from the audience. In fact, maybe even in the middle at a certain point. I think Walter might explain that. And I just want to say, please write them in the chat. There's the chat on the side. I will come back in. And any questions that you have, I'm going to come in and share them with Ren and Walter. So I will now pass it on to Ren and Walter to begin the program. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us. By way of introduction, I thought I'd tell a quick story that only occurred to me yesterday. I was at the Metropolitan here in New York, which has just opened this big surrealism show. And as I was coming up the stairs at the Metropolitan, I recalled how, God, is it 4 decades ago or something, in what was the first of the great blockbusters, there was a big show at the Met of King Tut's tomb. And I was going to be meeting somebody, and the line going into the Met on that day went all the way down Fifth Avenue, well into the 70s, and way, way down there, just a very, very long line. And I was sitting waiting for somebody. And I was watching one person in the distance taking cuts and taking more cuts and taking more cuts. And rather than what would typically happen in New York, where there would be a huge blow up and he'd be beaten up and so forth, he was leaving a trail of people laughing, and he kept taking more cuts and more cuts. And eventually he was coming up the stairs, and I leaned over to hear what he was saying. He was saying, "It's all right, I'm with the Tut family." Just allowed him to get in. Anyway, we won't be talking about Tut, but we're all with the Tut family today. So I'm really glad to have Walter, and as David was saying, Walter is a marvelous polymath. If you want to, last time he was here, you can go look it up on the Venice site. Maybe we can put that in the chat, how you find his the way back to his conversation about the rampancy of golden sections, golden ratios in both the face and in the on the screen. He and I have spent many, many hours talking about gravitational astroacoustics, which formed the basis of my book about him called Waves Passing in the Night. But we've also spent many, many hours talking about pyramids. And without getting into it at all, I'll just mention that he had an incredibly elaborate theory about why pyramids were specifically the places that they were, and so forth. And he was working on it for years, and then the slightest thing didn't quite match up, and he took all that work and just threw it out. But that just gives you some idea of how everything you're about to hear does match up, because if it didn't, he would have thrown it out. And with that, Walter, I'm going to hand it over to you. Just noting, as was said, that you'll be doing this will primarily be a slide talk, a PowerPoint keynote presentation. It'll be in 2 parts, and we'll take a little break in the middle for you to answer questions and so forth. The first part is somewhat easier. The second part is a little bit more challenging. It has kind of 8th grade mathematics in it. But anyway, I give it to you, Walter, and maybe tell us how you got into all this to begin with.
Okay, I should just preface everything by saying that I worked on a Francis Coppola film a decade or so ago, and the review in the New York Times ended with the statement, "Rated R for nudity and metaphysics," which I think is probably unique in the history of film criticism. But I'm apologizing sort of in advance, saying there is some mathematics here. So we don't have any nudity, but we do have some mathematics. It's, as Ren said, it's not difficult. It's kind of 8th or 9th grade mathematics, but most of you will be familiar with it because it's the Pythagorean Theorem. And we can speculate where the Pythagorean Theorem actually came from. My suspicions is that it came from Egypt, and it was named after Pythagoras, who promulgated it, but probably picked it up because he spent 12 to 20 years in Egypt as a student at the temple schools. So the information here goes way back, and that's another part of the appeal of this is that we're going to try to enter into the mindset of people who lived 5,000 years ago. Why did they do what they did? How did they do it? And it's fraught. It's a difficult question. I was reading a book by Arthur Koestler the other day, who said, when we try to write about in a novel or a film, people of the past, we either project our own feelings into them, so they become puppets of our own concerns, or we turn them into silhouettes, basically just fragmentary visions of who they might have been, but not well-rounded people. The appeal of what I'm going to say is that this gets into both aspects of it. The first half is, I think, recognizably human. Especially architects listening will nod their head and say, yes, that's kind of what happens. So there is, after all, it was only 5,000 years ago, and they're human beings. And so we will recognize the human struggle to achieve things in what they set out to do. The second half is a little more mysterious to get into. Why did they do that? I won't say any more about it, but we'll go through the first half and then take a little break and ask some questions and then plunge into the second half. I should also say the obvious, which is I'm not an Egyptologist. I got interested in this about 40 years ago when I was writing a screenplay about archaeology, and I visited Egypt. My wife and I went into the pyramids and wandered around, went into the king's chamber, and so it's a long-standing interest of mine. And in idle moments between films, I go back to it. And what I'm going to say today is the result of all that research. So let me do what I have to do here, which is to start the share screen program. And here we are. This picture was taken about 100 years ago, back when Egypt was a simpler place, and it flooded. So the Nile is very high in this picture. This no longer happens. And the main pyramid that you're looking at, which is the one we'll be focusing most on, is called the Great Pyramid. It was built 4,600 years ago for the Pharaoh Khufu, or Cheops, as he's also known, the Greek version of his name. And for many thousands of years, it was the tallest structure that human beings ever produced. The remarkable thing about it is that it's still standing, and we'll get into the reasons for that in a few minutes. it was approached 2,000 years later by the Lighthouse at Alexandria, also in Egypt, which was almost as tall, 110 meters, but roughly half the distance between us and the Great Pyramid was the Lighthouse of Alexandria. To give you a sense of the scale of that, this is the Colosseum in Rome, which was built in a little less than 2,000 years ago. And the first building that we are sure of that beat the Great Pyramid was Lincoln Cathedral in England, and it had a tower that was 160 meters tall. And unfortunately, after 250 years or so, it collapsed because they didn't quite know how to build something that tall. And it was in the late 19th century that America put up the Washington Monument, which is 170 meters tall. You'll notice that it looks like an Egyptian obelisk, and that was intentional. They wanted to say, here we are, we're the new Egypt or the new Rome, we're a new empire on the face of the earth. And 5 years later, it was eclipsed by the Eiffel Tower in Paris. And thereafter, the United States began building skyscrapers based on the architectural lessons learned by the Eiffel Tower. And that was culminated in 1931 by the Empire State Building, although the Woolworth Building in New York and many other buildings in Chicago and elsewhere were of an equivalent height. I'd just like to also point out that all of these buildings, except for the Empire State Building, are in a sense aspirational. They're religious, they're totemic things. Maybe not so much the Colosseum, although that's debatable. But the lighthouse was a lighthouse. The pyramid was a religious building of sorts. The Washington Monument is aspirational, but in the United States, appropriately, it's an office building. And we've seen, obviously, lots more buildings like this all over the world. The Burj Khalifa is presently the master. The classic pyramid age in Egypt lasted almost a little more than a century. These are the classic pyramids that we like to think of, built out of stone. And they were built almost right at the beginning of Egyptian civilization, right after the union of the north and south of Egypt into a single state. And it's arguable that the building of the pyramids was a big communal effort that helped the country become a single entity rather than two warring factions. So there were 6 pyramids, only 4 pharaohs. There were 20 million tons of limestone and granite, and there were 5 different profiles, and we'll get into the reasons for this in a few minutes. 54 degrees, 53 degrees, 52 degrees, 51 degrees, and an outlier, 43 degrees. So there are approximate dates of completion. There's a lot of argument about this, but the first one was the pyramid at Maidum, which was built 2613 BC, approximately, and it ended with the pyramid of Menkaure at Giza about 100 years later. Again, these are all approximate. And the 3 pyramids on the left are found in the neighborhood of Dashur, which is south of Egypt, south of Cairo by a number of kilometers. And then the 3 pyramids on the right are at Giza. They're the famous pyramids that we saw in the picture at the beginning. My mentor in all of this is the physicist Kurt Mendelsohn, who wrote a book called The Riddle of the Pyramids in 1974. And he had also visited Egypt and had toured all of the pyramids, including some that were not on the tourist trail at the time. And he came to some startling conclusions, which we'll be investigating and amplifying. Basically, he attacked this idea of pyramid construction, which is that a pharaoh comes into power and says, build me a pyramid, and people, maybe 20 or 30,000 people, come together and build a pyramid. And as the pyramid nears completion, fewer and fewer people work on it, and then it's done. And they say, Pharaoh, your pyramid is ready. And he says, thank you very much. I'll tell you when I'm ready to die. And maybe, I don't know, 10, 20 years, who knows, goes by, and then he dies. And then another pharaoh comes along and says, now I want a pyramid. There are various problems with this in terms of workflow, as we can examine. But Mendelsohn's idea is this, that pyramids, these 6 pyramids particularly, were being built one after the other. As one pyramid nears completion, a second is halfway built, and a third is in the planning stage. I'm going to call this the pyramid industrial complex. These are the first buildings, certainly the first massive buildings built entirely out of stone in history. So it was the equivalent of rockets to the moon. And once you, like the sorcerer's apprentice, once you wave your wand and say, I want to do this, certain things acquire an inertia and an inevitability. I think if you think about the drawing at the top, okay, all these people know how to build pyramids. Nothing is written down, really. It's all passed on from father to son. And then you send them away and they go back to being agriculture workers and farmers. And then a whole new generation comes up that has to learn everything all over again. It just doesn't work. So keep these images in the back of your mind, and we'll get into the reasons for this. Before going even deeper, I'd like to talk about their standards of measurement, which will become very important in the later discussions. They used the cubit, not the foot, not the meter. The cubit was, and this is one that is 1,000 years younger than the pyramids, which can be found in Italy at the museum in Turin. There is the cubit itself. It's a measurement from the elbow to the tips of the fingers of the king. It's called the royal cubit. And it's divided into 28 digits, not inches. Inches is based on the thumb. The Egyptians used the width of the finger, which is a little narrower than the thumb. And those were in turn divided into 7 palms, 4 digits per palm. So that's a palm. This is called a hand, 5 digits. To measure angles, which is what we're really be getting into, they used this system of taking 2 cubits at right angles to each other and then identifying places on each cubit and drawing a line between them. So if you did a slope of 28 over 28, this was, by the way, this is called a seked. I hope that's the right pronunciation. So a 28 by 28 slope, if you divide those 2 numbers together, you get 1. And the arctangent, which is how we derive angles, was 45 degrees. So if you were building something, they would say, give me a 28 by 28. Okay, yes, sir. But the Great Pyramid was built at an angle of 28-22. And that's the math. It gives you an angle of just under 52 degrees by our standards. Why 22? Why was this a good number? Here I'm going into speculation. which is fascinating, but advance warning, this is speculation. It's something that Mendelsohn speculated about himself, which is if you create a sphere, a circle rather, 1 cubit in diameter, that is 7 palms. Remember, 28 divided by 4 is 7 palms. If you do that, its circumference is 22 palms. Actually, 21.991. That's the formula. The circumference equals pi times the diameter. And 21.991 palms is about a little over 1.5 meters. However, the difference between these two numbers is 670 micrometers, the width of 2 grains of table salt. As far as we know, the smallest increment the Egyptians measured was 1/16 of a digit, just over 1 millimeter. So it's a difference that they probably would ignore. And they would say it is 22. Now, this is speculation, but if you let me run with this, you'll see my reasoning. By the way, a diameter of 7 is the only single-digit integer which yields a circumference that is also extremely closely an integer. So there's something magical and significant about it. If we do a seched, we get an angle of 17 degrees, a little more. And the ratio of 1 over pi is very close, 17.650 for the seched, 17.656 degrees for the 1 pi ratio. So 1 cubit to pi cubits. If you were crazy enough to say, let's build a pyramid at this angle, it would look something like this. And it wouldn't make much of an impression, especially considering all the work involved. So let's put ourselves into a mindset and say, all right, let's go up a notch and make it 2 pi. We add a cubit, and the pyramid is now steeper, but this is what's called the angle of repose of gravel, which is 32 degrees. And the seched of 14 over 22, or 2 over pi, is 32 degrees. A little more. So if we did this, if we were Egyptians wanting to build a pyramid, it would appear like a naturally occurring pile of stones. So a lot of work, but hey, I see this out in the desert when I go out, so why should we do this? So let's go up another notch, another cubit. So this is a 3 pi angle. And in fact, this is the elevation of the red pyramid, which we have seen, and the top of the bent pyramid, which are both at Dashur. Here's the red pyramid. It's called red because the stones have a red color. And this is very close to the angle of repose upper limit. So again, it's conceivably, it's still sort of natural. This is the bent pyramid, and the top of the pyramid is at a 3 pi angle. The bottom of the pyramid is a little steeper than 4 pi, and we'll get into the reasons for that in a second. So here we are. Let's go up another notch. Can we do this? So here is a 4 pi pyramid, which, as we saw, is the elevation of the Great pyramid at Giza. It's also the elevation of the earlier pyramid at Maidum, which, as you will see, is now a collapsed pyramid, which is significant. In terms of actual numbers, it's 280 cubits tall by 440 cubits on the bottom. And if we just look at the triangle on the left, it's 280 by 220, which is just like, is a 28 by 22 second. Could you get me a glass of water? To give a sense of the scale, here's a human being, but a human being as they actually would be next to the pyramid. There's a photograph. Each one of those levels is the levels of the stones. And here are some graphic representations of people working on the pyramid. And this is 300, but there were 100 times more people apparently working on the pyramid during the flood months, the summer months, as you see here. So it's an incredible thing when you think about what they achieved and when they achieved it using only human muscle and copper tools. Here is the collapsed pyramid at Maidum. And it was built 60 years before the Great Pyramid, and it was the first pyramid intended to have smooth sides. They had built one pyramid completed before that, which at Saqqara, which has the classic ziggurat stepped look to it. As far as we know, this pyramid started out as a stepped pyramid by the last pharaoh of the third dynasty, Mr. Huni, or Pharaoh Huni, rather. And he died before it was completed. And the next pharaoh, Snofru, said, yeah, I'll complete this for him, but I'm going to make it better. I'm going to make it with smooth sides. And this is the classic hubris, as we'll see. And it collapsed. Mendelsohn believes, and I believe with him, although there's contention about it, that this happened during construction, and we'll see why he felt this. Because this was the pyramid of a previous pharaoh, Huni, Snofru wanted his own pyramid, and so he was building one even steeper than this. He wanted more oomph to it. As we saw, the steeper, the more oomph. And this was underway. And then this pyramid collapsed. Bad news came from the north. Guess what happened? And the result is the bent pyramid. And the line you see where the angle shifts to a 3-pi pyramid is the moment of the collapse of Maidum, where they thought, okay, we don't know what we're doing here. We have to play it safe and go from a little steeper than 4-pi, but we're going to go down to 3-pi. And that's what we see in the bent pyramid. The next pyramid, Snofru probably looked at this or thought about it and said, I don't want a bent pyramid. I want a smooth pyramid. And they said, yes, sir. But we don't know how to make a steep, smooth pyramid yet. So we're going to build this next one entirely at 3-pi. The next pyramid in the pipeline was for the next pharaoh, Khufu, and that's known as the Great Pyramid. So that's a 4-pi pyramid. So a 4-pi, bent 3-pi, an entire 3-pi, and then the triumph of the steep, stable 4-pi pyramid. I'm saying 4-pi here because it's easier for me to say that than a sekhed of 28 over 22. As we saw, the difference is minuscule between these two things. So with the Great Pyramid, the Egyptians finally achieved the steep 4 pi elevation that they attempted, but failed to achieve with the pyramid at Maidum. Just to remind everyone that this is sort of the theory that there is overlapping here. There's a attempt at something fantastic. It collapses while the next pyramid is underway. A compromise is reached and another one is started. Meanwhile, the boffins back at the central command are figuring out what went wrong. How do we fix it? And they did. They figured out all the wrong things, and then they built the Great Pyramid at Giza. So I'm going to stop here and open it up for questions. This is the recognizable part of the effort, meaning it's human aspiration, defeat, retrenchment, figure something out, and then triumph. And the idea that there is overlapping work throughout this whole process, rather than build a pyramid, stop, wait till the next pharaoh, build a new pyramid.
So while other people are
those are the basic ideas here to take away.
So while other people are coming up with questions, I have two questions for you, or one observation. When you showed that chart of the industrial pyramid industrial complex, I couldn't help but think of the Hollywood industrial complex. That is basically what's going on. If you talk to any director, he's got the project he's currently working on. Somebody's writing a screenplay for the next one. He's already beginning to do. There's post-production, production, and so forth. So it struck me as that
it's human behavior, I think, and especially so, poignantly so, because of the collapse of the dream, and then how do you recover from the collapse of the dream?
Yeah, and it's interesting that so many films are precisely about aspiration and collapse. But another question, I'm just curious, given the mood of culture today, what is your position on were the Egyptians of that time, they're Africans, would we have thought of them as black? Would we, or what have you thought about that at all?
I don't want to get into it. My belief is that they are North Africans, very similar, let's say, to the people the Berbers of North Africa. There was a great desiccation of North Africa. The Sahara 10,000 years ago was like Kenya is today. It was full of water. It was a veldt. There were giraffes and elephants and all kinds of stuff going on. And then it began to dry out, and people went to the sources of water, to oases. And obviously the biggest moving oasis is the Nile. So the people who lived in North Africa 10,000 years ago, eventually 5,000 years ago, wound up, most of them along the Nile River, because that was a source of water. So I don't think they were black Africans.
There's a question from Gio Keller, and it's since the Giza pyramids were near water and flooded, could they have used and controlled flooding to move the heavy stones like the locks of the Panama Canal?
The short answer is absolutely yes. That the most of the limestone for the pyramids was quarried locally, but there were also higher quality limestone for the finishing from Tura, which is on the other side of the Nile River, and those were floated across. All of the granite for the pyramids, of which there was a lot, came from Aswan, way upriver, 600-700 kilometers upriver. So it's a massive undertaking. Get me, however many thousands of tons of granite. First of all, quarry it. Granite is hard. You have copper tools, which are soft, and then float them down river. But because of the flooding that you see in this picture, it was easier to get the stones closer to the pyramids during flood season. The other thing about the flood season is that for 4 months of the year, there was a lot of idle workers who couldn't farm because the fields were under the water. So this was another way of looking at it, is a make work project to take people from all over Egypt and bring them together to feed them, to house them, and inspire them by this amazing work. There's lots of graffiti in hidden places in the Great Pyramid of various teams saying, "Go team," basically. So the idea that there were slaves working on this is nonsense. It was all Egyptian people, and people working enthusiastically for something that had never been achieved ever before.
Walter, I don't know if this is known or not, but the collapse that you described, is it known? Was that a collapse due to the fact of internal spaces, or was it a collapse of the material? The material itself.
Good, very good question, and we'll get into that. But I'll say that the original plan, as I said, was a step pyramid of a certain base line, and they cleaned off the sand and were working on a stone base for that. When hubris began to take over and Snowfru said, "I want it to be bigger, wider, taller, and smooth-sided," the engineers no doubt said, "If we do that, we're going to extend into the sand. We don't have bedrock underneath it." And he said, "Do it anyway." And so they floated big slabs of limestone, I think, maybe granite, on the sand. And that was supporting the pyramid at its fringes. And this is not a good idea, as they discovered, that the weight of that, something happened. Was it an earthquake? Was it the occasional big rainstorm? We don't know. But something destabilized it. And once it destabilized, it collapsed.
We saw that in that big collapse. Yeah, we saw that in that big collapse in Florida recently.
Yeah,
it was destabilized base. Yeah.
So we're pretty sure that that's why it collapsed. When it collapsed, there are some people who say who don't agree with Mendelsohn, but we're going with him today. So,
well, why don't we go on to part two and put on your crash helmets, you mathophobes. Right. But don't worry, it's pretty easy.
Don't be scared, is what Ren is trying to say. So here are the three pyramids at Giza: the Great Pyramid, the pyramid for the next pharaoh, Khafre, and for the next, the little small pyramid for Menkaure, who was the next pharaoh. These pyramids, as we saw, are in a sense supernatural, just in the sense that stones do not naturally remain reposed at an angle greater than 45 degrees. And this is something that hits you when you visit the pyramids, when you're physically there, as Aggie and I were 40 years ago. It's like, uh-oh, this is steeper than it should be. And that gives you a sense, not only is the height amazing, but you have a queasy feeling in your stomach that something is slightly wrong or supernatural. And this is why it's built as steep as it is, because the pharaohs, who were considered to be gods on earth, wanted this sense of the divine. So, but we're talking more practically, and it's only the human agency can somehow have kept them still standing. Why are they still standing? So we're going to go inside the pyramid now. And we're going to go inside courtesy of the collapsed pyramid. Here we see the central core of the pyramid, which did not collapse. Or part of it did, but basically we're looking at 80% of the central core, which did not collapse. Why didn't it collapse? Because this is a schematic. The core of the pyramids are buttressed walls leaning against each other at 75 degrees. So we see triangulation here that is carried out in the core of the pyramid, and then the casing is added to give the sides to make them smooth. And we all know, I hope, that the triangle is the most rigid of geometrical structures. So in a sense, these walls leaning against each other are already collapsed. They don't have there's nowhere more that they can go. By the way, this is also a very familiar angle from Gothic cathedrals. The buttressing angle of the Gothic cathedrals is very similar. So there's the collapsed pyramid. And we imagine that in the center of the Great Pyramid is also these buttressed walls. And now we're going to go even deeper inside the pyramid to the King's Chamber, or the so-called King's Chamber, which is a smallish space inside about a third of the way up the pyramid. It's called the King's Chamber because that was the name that was given to it by early archaeologists. However, there's no evidence that anyone, let alone the Pharaoh, was ever buried in this, and we'll get into the reasons for that. Here's human beings giving you the scale of it. So in meters, it's a little over 5 meters wide, 10 meters long, and a little, almost 6 meters tall. But as we saw earlier, the Egyptians did not use meters, they used the cubit. These measurements, by the way, are by Sir Flinders Petrie, who was a monomaniac about accuracy, and they're accurate to 1/4 of a millimeter. But the royal cubit, we are pretty sure, was 0.5239 meters. So if you divide one into the other, you get a width of 10 cubits, a length of 20 cubits, and a slightly peculiar height of 11.1785 cubits tall. We'll get into that in a second. But first of all, was this chamber ever used as a tomb? There's a sarcophagus there, but there's no evidence from DNA sampling or whatever that there was ever anything organic in it. A few years ago, they discovered a 5th dynasty tomb, only 200 years younger than the pyramids. And this was for the secretary of the Pharaoh. So the question is, would the Pharaoh get an undecorated granite box and his secretary get this magnificent, vibrantly colored treatment? The intuitive answer is no. So it's unlikely anyone was ever buried here. So why was it built? What's going on? The answer is in the unusual height of this chamber. Here's a schematic of the chamber. 0.179 in fractions is 5/28. That's a familiar number. There were 28 digits in a cubit. And 5 digits was called a hand. So in engineering this space, somebody said, make it 11 cubits and a hand tall. My inquisitive mind wondered about the diagonal of the floor. What is that? And here's where Pythagoras, or probably the Egyptians who taught Pythagoras, comes in handy. So we take the square of the height of this triangle and the square of the length of the triangle, add them together, and we get 500 cubits. And then we take the square root of that and we get 22.36, which is 22 cubits and 2 hands. So the height of the room is half the diagonal of the floor. Since I struck pay dirt with that, I thought, well, what's the diagonal of the end wall? We use Pythagoras again. And it comes out to be 15 cubits to 0.999 accuracy. So now what's the diagonal across the room from the upper right-hand corner to the lower left-hand corner? And we get this triangular shape. Pythagoras helps us again, and it's 25. So 15, 20, and 25. This is called now a Pythagorean triple, because you can reduce these numbers to 3, 4, and 5. And if you erect a pyramid with those, you get the profile of the other pyramid at Giza, the Khafre pyramid, whose dimensions will reduce mathematically to this 3, 4, 5 angle. Here's the Khafre pyramid. Here's a schematic of it. In fact, it's 274 cubits tall. It's 205.5 cubits, half of the base. So that would be whatever, 411 across the base. And its hypotenuse is 342.5. But each of these numbers is divisible by 68.5. So this was intentionally built to be a Pythagorean triple. So in a sense, this also underlines the theory of Mendelsohn, which is that this pyramid industrial complex, these things were all being built not simultaneously, but one after the other. So they were building the Great Pyramid, not knowing whether it would stay up. You know, this is still, and they were already beginning to build the next pyramid, and the shape of that pyramid is encoded virtually within this king's chamber. This diagonal, by the way, I mean, this is sort of a by the way, the volume of the chamber, the width times the length times the height, is 2,235.7 cubits. But the diagonal floor, if you multiply it by 100, is 2,236. So it's accurate to within many decimal points. But here's a curve. The present floor is a false one. The chamber's actual floor is covered by slabs of granite. You can see them there, 1/4 of a cubit thick. So here's a schematic of the actual floor of the room in dotted line. So all of those precise measurements that we just explored were made possible by the architects of the pyramid having raised the floor by 1/4 cubit, thus making the height of the room exactly half of the diagonal of the floor. So this is a tricky move, but they're obviously intentional. So we naturally wonder, what are the dimensions of this other room, the original room, before it was elevated by 1/4 of a cubit? Well, if you look at the far wall, you see it's 5 ranks of big, big granite blocks, massive granite blocks, which extend underneath the present floor. The fifth one goes down. So each of them is 64 digits, which is about 1.2 meters. So each of them is the same height. And going back to a schematic here, 64, if you add all of those up, you get 320 digits. On the original floor, it was 11 cubits and 5 digits, but we've added 7 digits, which is a quarter of a cubit, and 313 plus 7 is 320. So the floor, the room before this extra level was floated is 320 digits tall. The length of the room is 560 inches or digits, and the width is 280. 10 times 28 is 280. So the curious mind says, the length plus the height is 880. If you divide that number by the width, that reduces to 22/7, which is 3.1429 in decimals, which is very, very close to pi. In fact, that's the degree of accuracy. 4 parts in 10,000, or let's say the 2 grains of salt. Here's the far wall, the big side wall in digits. If you add up those digits to get the perimeter of the sidewall, you get 1,760. If you get into a drone camera and fly over the pyramid and look at it from above, each of its 4 sides measured in cubits are 440. And that's 1,760 cubits. The ratio of the height to the base is 0.6364, which is the ratio of 4/2 pi, or 2/pi. So there's the pyramid, 440 cubits on a side, 280 cubits tall. And here's the room, 280 cubits wide. I've flipped the room on its side for the purposes of this exercise. So the perimeter is 1,760 digits. The width is 280 digits, which gives you this 2 pi ratio. And the pyramid itself is 1,760 cubits, perimeter, height 280, which also gives this 2 pi ratio. The digit is 1/28 of a cubit. So the linear dimensions of the Great Pyramid are 28 times those of the King's Chamber. The King's Chamber is measured in digits. The pyramid is measured in cubits. And there were 28 digits to a cubit. Here we're looking at the floor of the chamber and looking at that diagonal, which we saw before. If we do a similar trick, which is compare the width plus the hypotenuse to the length, we get a rectangle whose aspect ratio is 1.6180339, which is the golden ratio, or phi. The golden ratio, which we talked about last time, is found throughout nature, from galaxies to crystals to flowers and DNA, as well as the proportions of the human face. Here's the lovely Ingrid Bergman. Her eyes are at the golden ratio between her hairline and chin. It's an irrational number like pi with the decimal value of 1.618, blah, blah, blah. So this rectangle has an aspect ratio of phi to 1. The current mathematical definition of phi is 1 plus the square root of 5 over 2. You'll notice the similarity between that and the proportions of this chamber. So the ratio of the length of the chamber floor to the width of the chamber floor plus the diagonal of the floor is phi. It's a mouthful, but we'll leave it at that. If you take that length and rotate it slightly, you get a triangle whose height is x. We can calculate that as the square root of phi, thanks to Pythagoras. This is called the Kepler Triangle today because of Johannes Kepler, who promulgated it. And this shape gives you the profile of the Great Pyramid to 0.9994 accuracy. We're comparing that to our Sekhed pi pyramid, which was 4 to pi. I will add coincidentally that the hypotenuse of that is phi times pi, accurate to 1.0006. And if we superimpose the Great Pyramid on this shape, we get it accuracy to 1.0004. So here's an ideal profile of the Great Pyramid with a Sekhed of 2822. Here's the profile of a phi pyramid. And here's the profile of a pi pyramid. And the width of the lines, and I could have made them much smaller, but they wouldn't have shown up on the screen so much. The Sekhed angle fits extremely narrowly between a shallower phi and a steeper pi pyramid. So narrowly that the thickness of the lines obscures it. So this very close alignment is the source of a lot of the mysticism about the pyramid. Is pi encoded in the pyramid? Is phi encoded in the pyramid? As far as the Egyptians were concerned, they were building a pyramid at Sekhed 28/22. My hunch is that they knew that this was the ratio of the diameter of a circle to the circumference of the circle, to this very, very close approximation. And to their way of thinking, it was the same. Whether they knew about phi is another question. That's kind of an outlier. My hunch is that they did not. So this is coincidental. But when you read about the pyramid and read about all of the mysticism of it, you will see pi and phi popping up a lot. And the reason is that the contingency between the Sekhed of 2822 and 4 pi and pi over the square root of phi is extremely, extremely close. And that's the source of all of this information. So here is where we come up against the mystery of a mindset that is alien to us. Why would you build this at great expense, this room? I mean, the pyramid itself is a great expense, but to the engineering of this room was, as you saw, a considerable achievement. Why would you do this and then seal it up in the center of the pyramid and never intend to go in it? And as far as we know, never publicize it. Well, this is the mysteries of arcane religious thinking. They knew it was there, the priests did, and that was all that matters, to protect it somehow in a spiritual sense.
You can think of this room as kind of the soul of the pyramid, containing the essence of the mathematics by which the pyramids were built. And it didn't need to be visited, it just needed to be there. And then we non-believers busted our way in and discovered all of this stuff, which wasn't supposed to happen. That wasn't the original intention of any of this.
So the two pyramids, one was built at a 2821, slightly steeper than the Great Pyramid, but not as tall. And the Great Pyramid was built at 2822. And these ratios are all extremely closely encoded in this architectural miracle. And I'd love to answer any questions that anyone has about all of this mountain of information, this pyramid of information.
Why don't I start with a few questions while people, and they should be putting them into chat if they have questions. First of all, my thought, and you're disabusing me of that thought, was that this was something like the plaque that Carl Sagan put on the side of the Pioneer, you know, the hands waving and the pictures of all those kinds of things, and that this was in fact intended as a message to the future, you know. Here we were, we knew all this stuff, just so you know, we knew, you knew, da, 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 da.
Right.
And you say that's not the case.
There's similarities in the sense. In other words, we did retrieve Carl Sagan's plaque in a sense by busting into the pyramid and then measuring it so exactly. But it was not intended to be discovered in that same sense. Sagan,
I just wonder whether there were, you know, two priests talking to each other that say, boy, this is going to be really something someday if somebody gets in here and figures it out, and this will be like.
That's the danger of what I talked about earlier, the projecting us onto these silhouettes of the past. Mm-hmm. What did they think? What did they know? We just don't know. Now, I should say also that remember that the Egyptian civilization, which was the greatest civilization at the time, and arguably the first massive civilization, nation state in history, they had no reason to think that this was not completely permanent forever. The idea that civilizations would rise and fall is not present when you're doing the first. And in fact, it lasted for 3,000 plus years more. And so the idea that there is a future that would look back on them that's an alien concept. I think that's important to keep in mind.
By the way, why is it that all this only happened for 120 years and then it fell away and it was forgotten? Was it forgotten or what happened?
There are two answers to that. One is that they were trying to achieve a stable pyramid shape of a certain steepness and height, and they were disabused of that with the very first one that they tried to build, and eventually they achieved it. And at that point, they had their moonshot in a sense. They achieved what they wanted to achieve, and so in a sense, the gas went out of the balloon. You can tell that by the size of the third pyramid, which is kind of an afterbirth. And after that, there were a few things attempted, but nothing on this scale. And shortly after, I think in the 6th dynasty, there was a massive collapse of Egyptian civilization into a dark age that lasted for 200 or 300 years. In the Middle Kingdom, which was a fantastic era, they also attempted to build pyramids, but by that time they'd forgotten how to do it. And they built them out of mud brick, and they've all collapsed. So
this reminds me, by the way, your description is very much like the moonshot. We went to the moon, and then we lost interest and then we built the space shuttle. The space shuttle is like the third.
Yeah.
That's kind of the third, or the space, the space exploratory thing up there. But that's maybe we'll never get back to the moon. We'll see. One other question, just to get something for you to think about, and I'm probably knowing you already have, but what's the deal with the dimensions of the sarcophagus inside there? Is that a mini version of the bigger one, or is it?
Yeah, I wish it were. I've gone over it, and nothing pops out of it. It's a mystery. It's a mystery why it's there, other than as symbolic. The sarcophagus of the Egyptian soul. That's arguable, but we also don't know why it's got that chip out of it. Was this early tomb robbers who expected gold and got angry, and so they? I don't know. Nobody seems to know what the answer is.
So, David, are there other questions?
Yes, there's a number of questions here, but first, I have a question. It's incredible, Walter. Thank you so much. That I'm working here. The room unfolding to the pyramids blossoming out of the room, the pyramids folding into the room. It's incredible, and I don't want to over push the question of film and focus, but that double floor thing, man. I'm really curious. Do you think there's two things that enter my mind? One is it was like a refocusing, like they were correcting the number by putting, right. But the other, so that's what the other is actually maybe more binocular, maybe more like they wanted both.
I think it's binocular. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it is. Again, right. It's not. We have to get out of the mindset of see it, think it. It's almost like a devilishly constructed conceptual artwork. If you get into that mindset of conceptual art, that goes a few inches toward a possible explanation. But I think it is binocular. Because of the precision with which the real room encodes the pi, I think it's double.
Yeah, I agree. It's not a correction.
Right.
It's literally the double. It's the double. Because the whole thing is about doubling ultimately, right? Mm-hmm. It's all being doubled and encoded and enfolded into the world. All right, so there's a bunch of questions here. I'm gonna try to share some from Gil Kaufman. Were they using constellations and planetary positioning to measure out the pyramids, in which case the measurements would already be encoded to some extent?
I don't know. I know there's a lot of thought about this, and I can't answer the question. There's the Orion's belt theory of the stars and the placement of the pyramid. It's possible. My mind didn't go there, so I can't answer that question.
That's great. Jacob Alspector. Hey, Jake. You described 3 different types of stones, 2 limestones and 1 granite.
Right.
Where were they used in particular, and why?
The locally sourced limestone is the bulk in the middle of the pyramid, how the pyramid got built. Then for very critical areas like the King's Chamber, they used granite because it's harder. And the facing of the pyramid, the skin of the pyramid, was a higher quality limestone from the other side of the Nile, from Tura. So those are the 3 different stones that were used.
Sorry to interject. It wasn't structural. I thought perhaps they had corrected some of the structural collapse problems using the granite, but you say it was foundational, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't know, but I think not. I think the 90 of the bulk of the pyramid is locally sourced, slightly lower quality limestone than what they would use for the skin.
Chris Siebert, do you have any thoughts on what the empty spaces that were found by the Moon project in the Great Pyramid might be? MUON.
Yeah, I have heard about this, and I've read a couple of articles on it, but again, it's beyond my focus. Without question, there are still more mysteries. Where was the pharaoh buried? We haven't found it yet. If the king's chamber was not his burial place, which we don't think it was, then where is he? We don't know.
It really is mind-boggling. I mean, it's a riddle, right?
Yeah.
King's chamber is empty, but it contains the mystery of the entire structure.
Yeah. I should say that the Great Pyramid is the only pyramid that has this room up inside the pyramid. The other pyramids have chambers, but they're beneath the pyramid. So this is a special thing.
Right, the other ones are under the ground.
Yeah.
It occurs to me, by the way, I wonder whether the place in the pyramid where it is the place in the industrial complex where they were when the other one was being completed. So and then
I don't think so.
And then they were able to encode its dimensions into that room as they were building the room, or
there probably is some mathematics to its location. I haven't figured that one out yet, but there's a massive, what's called the Grand Gallery, which is a massive staircase leading to the king's chamber, which is a piece of architecture in itself. And so that had to be all very carefully planned long in advance.
It's funny, by the way, I'm thinking about everything you're describing in the context of what James Turrell is doing right now at Roden Crater, with all kinds of mathematical mysteries being built into it as he goes and so forth. By the way, and I'm eager to see if there's going to be more comments, but I am not as sure as you are. Let me put it this way. Your comment that we can't know how they're thinking, what they thought like, reminds me of the argument that says, you can't know whether dogs have emotions. And I remember one scientist say, well, the thing about dogs is they never smile, which is crazy. They obviously do. They smile with their tails.
Right.
And I think that it's been a huge dead end on the part of science. Not in order to avoid anthropomorphizing, they missed the obvious.
Right.
And I think that you may be in danger in your modesty and in your insistence which I think is at some level correct, that we can't just project our own selves back there. But I can't believe that the master priests who are sitting there setting up the whole room don't in some way, I mean, they have a sense of future as much as we do, in the sense that, they're living, they know they had parents, they know they have children and so forth. I mean, I just can't imagine that they weren't in some way secretly saying, well, this is cool. Somebody's going to find this someday and it's going to be really cool.
Maybe it's, but I go back to what I said earlier, that they did have a sense of the future in terms of families and dynasties and everything. But the idea that Egyptian civilization would stop, it was not in their mindset, I think. This was it. This is how human beings would be forever. So that idea that we have to send something to a future that we can't imagine is, that's the difference. Well, and I think the whole binocular thing that we were talking about earlier is the case, that they're human beings. And we know know that what a human being is, and the aspiration and disappointment and struggle and all of that. But there are also some things like this whole idea of the King's Chamber as a conceptual artwork. We're going to put it there and then seal it up and never talk about it. That's to us today, that is strange.
But even that, and there are conceptual arts works like that, but but this artist who does it secretly thinks, yeah, but it will be found someday. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is precisely because they figured Egyptian civilization would go on forever, they figured that this is something that years and years from now, at another point of civilization, this will be seen and it will be quite wonderful. It's a little present, a little prize in the center of the thing. Anyway, there's no way of knowing, obviously, and obviously, I think you and I are both believers that the best stuff is stuff that can't be known for sure.
I'd throw something else out there. I think it's possible that at least part of the impetus had to do with their understanding of the integration of these mathematical conditions, certainly the golden section, into life itself.
Right.
Meaning it wasn't so much about interpretation or its future reading as that's what it takes to get it right.
Right.
You see, meaning if they understood the way the seeds work and plant structures and life and growth and all of the things we've seen just in the golden section, bring that to a planetary scale, et cetera, they were maybe they wanted it to work. Mm-hmm. It's like a combustion engine, a valve, right. It needs to be the right size so that the, combustion occurs. And for whatever they were trying to build, it needed to work.
Yeah. Another way of putting it is that in the heart of the pyramid is the heart of the pyramid.
Exactly.
Right.
And it isn't about human consciousness later interpreting it or recognizing it or understanding it. It's about the pyramids doing their function, right. And be connected to life.
Yeah.
So. Are there any other questions?
Let me see this.
The Egyptians were obviously very religious people, and the concept of the Ba and the Ka, which were the soul, the concept of the soul. So in a sense, this room is the soul of the pyramid. It's this, as you said, the heart of it, but also, we could also think of it as the soul, trying to capture in slightly immaterial terms, although made out of matter, the relationship that allowed this pyramid to be stable, et cetera.
That in turn reminds me of just the notion you get in Descartes, for example. First of all, one of the things you said a second ago, where the Egyptians were different from us. We are Egyptians. Using Pythagoras as an example, so much of the heart of our civilization was things that were being figured out at that point, and they continue, and you are a magus from that tradition yourself, Walter. But the way that Descartes will get at that eventually is he will talk about that reason, that he talks about the light of reason is clarity and distinctness and so forth, and it is in the world there is reason, but that there's a little, as it were, a drop of that, of light of reason inside of our, or let's put it this way, that God at the beginning says fiat lux and there is light, and then Descartes says there is inside of each of us a little tiny droplet of light which allows us to see things as clear and distinct.
Right.
And in a certain sense, that same model is the model of what's happening inside the pyramid.
Right.
The world is like this, and inside the heart of the pyramid is this thing. And they reflect each other.
Duane is asking if there's evidence of pi or phi being discovered in historical texts, sort of pre this, period? Like, is it?
Yeah, there is a mathematical document from 1,200 years later called the Rind Papyrus, which is a series of exercises for mathematicians, and it's ambiguous. Pi seems there's one problem trying to calculate the area of a circle. And here, the approximation of pi is not as exact. It's 3.16 something or other. But we know that the formula for the area of the circle is a complicated mindset to get into. Archimedes eventually figured it out. But the relationship between the diameter of a circle and the circumference of a circle is something that a 6-year-old can figure out. You make a circle of a certain diameter, and then you take a piece of string and wrap it around the circle, and then measure the difference between the diameter and the string, and you've got pi. So it's apparently in the Rind Papyrus, the relationship of that ratio to the area of the circle was not so definite. So that, yeah, that's the Egyptians were not graphomaniacs like the Greeks became. They didn't, there's a little evidence here and there, but they didn't say, here's what I did and here's why I did it.
And by the way, in terms of the Greeks, a whole part of Socrates' teachings were don't write it down.
Right.
That's at the heart of Socrates. And
Plato,
the profound moment in philosophy is when Plato disavows Socrates' instructions and starts writing it down, in the same way that Max Brod will later disavow Kafka and will not destroy the material and so forth, on very similar grounds, actually.
Exactly. And all of those guys spent time in Egypt. In the relationship between Greece and Egypt was very much like the mid-century relationship between Americans and Europe. You weren't really cultured unless you had gone to Europe and then come back to New York. And similarly in Greece, Plato, Socrates, Jesus, Pythagoras, they all went to Egypt and picked up stuff. And then gave it their own spin.
Right. As I say, we're all Egyptians ever after.
Any more questions?
Pardon?
Are there any more people questions?
Yeah. Anybody?
No, there's a few comments. Farzad is pointing out, Farzad Mahutian is pointing out that the king's chamber is analogous to Gnome, the mathematical heart and soul.
Yeah, I would say yes.
Anyway.
Wow.
Well, this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic, Walter.
Well, thank you.
We'll have to get together on your next wild ride, Walter. But
whatever that is, I don't know.
Well, I suspect there are pieces of it all over the place already, but anyway, this has been really, really, really fun, and thank you all for joining us. And by the way, Thursday, this coming Thursday, it'll be in the evening in Eastern time here in New York at 7:30. I'm going to be having a conversation with Benjamin Labatut, the author of this remarkable, remarkable book. Talk about trying to figure out what things felt like when you weren't there. Labatut has written this book that has been winning prizes and called in America called When We Cease to Understand the World. It has just been published by New York Review Books here in the United States. And it is, among other things, trying to imagine what it was like for the physicists and mathematicians and chemists at in the first third of the last century as they were stumbling into quantum mechanics. nowadays we all know that Richard Feynman teaches us, don't try to figure out what this is. It's just, it's just how.
Shut up and calculate, right?
Yeah. Don't calculate. It just works. Just be satisfied. But to try to imagine, the book that Labatut has written is not a nonfiction work. It is definitely a novel. And what is novelistic about it is to get us inside the heads of Schrödinger and Schwarzschild and Heidegger and various other people when they were stumbling into that, and how completely vertiginous and harrowing that must have been, how it was blowing everybody's minds. And it's a very short book, extremely, extremely good. And I'm really excited that we're going to see him. And then a week after that, a week from Thursday, we're going to be having a conversation with Ramiro Gomez, who has recently been going through a gender transformation to J. Lynn Gomez, but he is a remarkable, remarkable Latino artist who kind of gets at all the work that is not noticed in all those fantastic architectural splendors that people live in the Hollywood Hills and so forth. That all those all the Neutra glass walls and all the hedges and so forth, and all the work that goes into it, and recognizing that, and it's a marvelous body of work. So that's the rest of the season. So next Thursday and the following Thursday. Hope as many of you as can will join us. And back to you, David.
Great. No, I absolutely just want to thank everybody for coming, and thank you, both Ren and Walter. It was really stunning, and left us with a lot of work to do. And I really appreciate that. It was a beautiful contribution to the whole exhibition we're having. So thank you so much, both of you.
Very good. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.